Welcome to Excelsior, a podcast aimed to inform the general public about immunology. I am your host, Candice Limper. From this episode, you're going to learn how the development of vaccines has altered the extent and way which we are affected by a virus. We're going to dive into the past to describe what it was like to live in the 1950s. This was a time when Elvis Presley was the coolest cat around. Although this was a great time to be alive, it was also one of the scariest times too, especially if you had little ones living at home. This was mainly because of a virus called polio. Nobody really gets polio anymore because we have developed a vaccine to prevent it from infecting us. However, it is important to not forget this virus so we can understand the importance of vaccines. To describe what it was like to be infected, you're going to get a first-hand account. Today we are going to talk with Frank Smith from Ithaca area, who is currently living in an assisted living care facility. This happens to also be where we'll be conducting the interview. At a young age, Frank had contracted the poliovirus that resulted in him losing his ability to walk. Frank is generous enough to discuss what he went through to help us to understand how powerful this virus was and to help us comprehend the scientific breakthroughs required to prevent it from spreading. Thank you, Frank, for taking the time to meet with me today and letting me ask you questions of what happened so long ago with polio.
Thank you for having me. I am glad to be able to share my experiences with so many people who probably don't know what polio is.
I totally agree. You're going to help educate a lot of our listeners. We are happy to have you. But let's dive in. Frank, how did you first recognize that you might have gotten polio, and how old were you?
I remember when I was 13 years old, returning home from a dance. It was when I was riding my bike back home, and all of a sudden, my legs gave out, and I couldn't move. I actually fell. I don't remember much about falling, either because of my head hitting the ground, or because I was delirious with fever. My most vivid memory after the fall was waking up in a hospital, and I was in a room with these giant machines called iron lungs. I didn't know it at the time, but that machine was keeping me alive. I remember being in a room with other kids my age, all laying inside the same type of machine. I recall it being a large, gray, metal-looking contraption that covered my entire body except for my head and neck. I couldn't see much because I couldn't move my head, but I would see a few things through a mirror. I think that was what helped keep my sanity during that time. I remember being so afraid, not of the pain, but mostly of losing control of my body.
So Frank, from what I understand, the scene you described was something not entirely unheard of between the early 1910s and early 1950s. The polio didn't prefer one victim versus another. It didn't care about race, gender, or social class. The only thing that it preferred were children, and there wasn't a thing a parent could do to protect their kids. During this time, nobody knew how polio was transferred from person to person. However, it was known that it was a virus because in 1908, scientists Karl Landsteiner and Erwin Popper had simultaneously discovered what it was. From my research, they found out that the poliovirus did not affect everyone the same way. So nobody knew who or how they were going to be affected. The virus could pass through a person and give them flu-like symptoms to losing their feelings to the limbs, which is also known as childhood paralysis, or even cause death. So Frank, how do you think you got polio? Did you have a friend around that had it, or was it something that you noticed after you had gotten sick?
You know, funny thing you mentioned that. Right before I was in the hospital, I was on my way home from the dance. I was talking to my friends about polio, because a few of our friends didn't attend because they were in the hospital.
So now we're going to go back in time to when Frank was at the dance, and when he was having a conversation with his friends, Jack and Leslie, right before his bike crashed.
Hey Frank, how you doing? Where's Rose? I heard you were doing backseat bingo down at the Passion Pit.
You know, I was just with Rose yesterday, and yes, we were at the drive-in theater, but I was just at her house today, and her mom told me that Rose is now in the isolation ward with polio. Rose's mom said that some people in suits came into her room and put all of her belongings on the lawn and burned up all of her things to a crisp. They even burnt the pogo stick that I bought her last Christmas. It is hard to believe this happened to poor Rose. As I left the house, I read a plaque that they left on the door saying that someone in the house had gotten polio. It's going to be hard to have a gay time without Rose now. I hear that there is no telling how a person is going to be affected by polio. Time was the only true teller of what would happen. I wish there was something we could do. What are you thinking, Leslie? You have been awfully quiet.
I'm trying to think of something we can do. You know, it could probably help raise money for the March of Dimes. They keep on needing more and more money because each summer it gets worse and worse. I wonder when all this is going to stop. My parents keep on worrying about us kids getting it, but just the other day I heard someone's mom died.
This dance doesn't razz my berries. I'm going to go home to donate my dimes in a pinky bag for the March of Dimes.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
I feel the same way. Let's go together.
We parked all of our bikes near the front of the school, right? I might give you guys my coins. I think I need to rest. I'm starting to feel like I'm starting to get some chills, and I really don't want to get sick.
Frank! Are you okay? Jack, you should ride to his house to get his parents over here. I'll stay here with Frank to make sure he's okay.
That is pretty much what happened before I fell off the bike. It was pretty ironic that I was about to help people with this exact sickness that I ended up getting. Pretty sure I got polio from Rose. We were both in the D.T. Watson's home for crippled children. I was happy to at least have a friend around in such a scary time. I remember coming out of the iron lung. My muscles were weak and sore. I felt like a baby because I had to learn how to walk all over again. The first time I tried to stand was in a pool. After a lot of physical therapy, I was told that I was never going to walk again. At the time, I didn't understand the gravity of this, but eventually became thankful for other things in my life, like continuing to see Rose, and the day we became husband and wife. Additionally, Rose was fortunate enough to regain her walking ability. There wasn't anything that we could have done to prevent the spread of polio. However, we had hope because it was publicized that scientists were trying to make a vaccine.
That's interesting. I read an article that said in 1935, 2 independent groups of scientists who were concurrently testing a polio vaccine. In combination, there were 22,000 children that enrolled in this clinical trial to receive either nothing to serve as a control or the treatment, a killed poliovirus, meaning that this virus was not supposed to cause disease. Unfortunately, neither of the projects ended up working because the patients got polio due to the flaw in the vaccine design. Were you aware of this clinical trial that happened about 20 years before you had polio?
When I was young, I didn't know about the clinical trial, but maybe my parents knew about it. It is interesting that you brought that up because Rose and I ended up being on a clinical trial ourselves. One of the proudest things I did while at the D.T. Watson's home was participating in the clinical trial for a polio vaccine in 1956. When they were looking for children volunteers, I remember a nurse telling me that the vaccine may not help me, but it has the potential to prevent my friends and loved ones from getting polio. Looking back, I don't think I should have been as excited about going on that clinical trial. I recall asking if I was going to walk again, and hearing the nurse say no. Regardless, it did not take a lot for me to sign up because I knew it was going to prevent other people from getting polio.
It turned out that Frank and Rose were 2 of the 43 patients who received the polio vaccine by a clinical trial that was started by Jonas Salk, a young, ambitious scientist that was working with a team to develop the first vaccine.
Looking back, I don't think I should have been as excited going on that clinical trial. Nobody knew what was going to happen. We're living in a time when people were so eager to have something to save us from polio that we're more willing to try anything.
I'm glad it ended up working out for you in the end. It is scary to think about how the polio virus affected so many people and to think that someday it might happen again with a different virus. This is one reason why it's important to learn from our past so we can be better prepared for the present and future. Well, thank you, Frank, for your transparency and participating in our show. The second portion of this episode is going to be talking with my co-host today, Justin Limper, who also happens to be my better half. Justin is going to provide us some facts that he has learned about while investigating polio. All right, Justin, tell us what you have found.
I definitely wouldn't go as far as saying better half, but I think I would say equal counterpart is a good way to put it. But
that's fair.
All formalities aside. So, if I'm allowed, I will kind of jump into some intro facts that I found that were really interesting just on polio. And I'm going to kind of go over some chronological facts just in order to kind of give you a little bit of history, but also that I found interesting. And that might be a jumping off point in case anybody wants to dig in a little bit further. And then just kind of the epidemic update, because that's what this was. This was a major epidemic. So polio is a distant memory in much of the world, but it still exists in some places. And overall, polio affects mainly children that are under 5. So 1 in 200 infections will lead to irreversible paralysis, so usually in the legs. And then among these paralyzed 5 to 10% will die when their breathing muscles become immobilized. So referencing back to that iron lung that we heard about in our story.
I wonder who made that iron lung.
Maybe we'll find out. So there is no cure for polio, can only be prevented. Polio vaccine given multiple times can protect a child for life. And then 90% of people who get infected with polio virus will not show any visible symptoms. And people
So they'll just be like walking around shedding the polio virus and not even know they're sick.
So people who don't show any symptoms can still infect others with the virus. They carry the virus. For those who do not show symptoms, they are normally flu-like symptoms. So as we alluded to in the story, they'll show symptoms like sore throat, fever, tiredness, nausea, headache, and stomach pain. And some people infected with poliovirus will experience more severe symptoms that affect the brain and spinal cord, including paralysis.
Oh, okay.
So just some facts that I thought were really interesting, kind of in chronological order. The first clinical description of polio was described by Michael Underwood. He was a British physician. Now that was back in 1789.
That was a long time ago.
That was a long time ago. So we definitely had some warning about it, but I don't think anybody really understood the potential of the virus back then, or maybe even what it was, and definitely wouldn't have been able to predict the negative impact.
Where was that at again?
He was a British physician, so I'm guessing Europe.
Oh, so
if not
Europe?
If not Great Britain. So jumping up to the early 1800s, the first outbreaks appeared in Europe, and then the first known outbreak was in Canada in 1910. So 100 years later, the first known outbreak, even though it was starting to appear earlier.
I wonder how it got to Canada. So a carrier from a ship would have had to go from Europe or survive the voyage to Canada.
Yeah, it's definitely an interesting thought. So you can think of people traveling over from Europe to the U.S. or Canada on a ship, probably multiple children. So who knows how long the polio virus could survive? Maybe on its own, but it would have the host, the child, and then either the child would survive all the way. It's most likely to spread in children under 5, but not necessarily the only carriers. Anybody could be a carrier, any age.
Yeah.
Okay, so then the likelihood of it traveling on a carrier, either somebody showing symptoms or not, from Europe to Canada is pretty likely.
Yeah.
Okay, so bringing it back from 1910 to 1916, New York experienced the first large epidemic in the U.S. with more than 9,000 cases and over 2,000 deaths.
What year was that?
So that was 1916.
Wow, that's a lot of deaths.
A lot of deaths, and 102 years ago.
Yeah, I feel like that's not that long ago.
It's not that long ago.
Yeah.
I mean, for my life, that's a long time ago, but like the history of the world, that's not that long ago.
Yeah.
So nationwide, the same year, there were 9,000 cases in New York and 2,000 deaths. There were 27,000 cases nationwide and over 6,000 deaths. So a lot of people were getting sick, a lot of people dying.
And to think that most of those were like kids.
Yeah.
I bet the parents were freaking out.
I mean, that could be a whole generation. It's pretty crazy.
Not a whole generation, but a lot of kids.
Part of a generation.
Yeah.
Okay, so bring it up 13 years. In 1929, Philip Drinker and Louis Shaw created the iron lung, which we alluded to earlier. We said we might talk about it, so here it is. It's a respirator that provided breathing support for people with paralysis of the respiratory muscles. So, as we said, it affects all muscles, including the lungs and respiratory muscles. So when that starts to fail, you can't breathe. Mm-hmm. So this apparatus just did the breathing for you. Pretty scary. You're pretty much just trapped, but it kept you alive.
It was scary hearing Frank talk about it and just not being able to move and then just laying there.
I can't even imagine.
Yeah. And then hopefully you could start walking again, and get out of that machine.
I get antsy after like an hour.
Yeah.
I don't think I could do it.
You'd have to.
Yep. Frank's a strong guy.
And Rose.
Both of them.
Yeah.
In 1940, scientists concluded that the consumption of ice cream was the leading cause of polio. Solely based on the status that there were more cases of polio in the summer.
Oh, really?
Which was also when children ate the most ice cream.
Yeah, that's insane.
So we've come a long way in 78 years from 1940, but...
yeah, I think we know a lot more than that.
Oh, God,
that's
I
crazy.
would hope so.
Can you imagine all the kids avoiding ice cream?
Can you imagine not being able to eat ice cream because it...
You thought it caused polio?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's crazy.
All right, so bringing it up a few more years, FDR founded an organization.
Wait, who's FDR?
So FDR, Franklin D. Roosevelt, was the 32nd president of the U.S., and he founded an organization to find a cure for polio because he had polio himself. And he believed that if everyone gave only a dime, polio would be eradicated. Because of this motto, after his death in 1945, FDR's face was put on the dime and was organized by
Wait, our real dime? His face is on our dime?
Yeah.
I didn't know that. I have to look at my dime right now.
And hence the March of Dimes. So, up to the 1950s, the polio vaccine was accused of being part of the communist plot to socialize medicine. 1953, the disease reached its peak in Canada, where almost 9,000 cases and 500 deaths happened. This was the worst national epidemic since the 1918 influenza pandemic. So here's some good news, or at least to the happier part. In 1955, Jonas Salk chose not to patent his polio vaccine for the benefit of humanity, which it really did and does benefit humanity. But as a scientist and not a businessman, he missed out because that would have been earnings of an estimated $7 billion.
Wow.
So
that's a lot of money.
Good guy. Everyone go have a drink for him.
I still can't believe he's on our dime, and I had no idea. Wow.
So in 1955 as well, what became known as the Cutter incident. So this is not so good news. They released some lots of the Cutter vaccine, and despite it passing the required safety test, it contained the live polio virus, which was supposed to be an inactivated virus vaccine. And eventually they withdrew it from the market, but the mistake produced 120,000 doses of polio vaccine with the live polio virus. 40,000 children developed polio from
40,000?
Yeah, 40,000 kids from one screw-up.
Wow.
Yeah, no bueno. 5 children died, and the exposure led to an epidemic of polio in the families and communities of the affected children.
So it affected even more than the 40,000.
Yep, it just spread like wildfire from there. Another 113 people were paralyzed and another 5 deaths. So 10 deaths total, so not insane, but that's still a pretty big screw up, and definitely something you'd think that shouldn't happen, especially from, amazing accredited scientists out there that are really trying to do good, but,
No matter what you do, and nothing's going to be perfect. And I feel like, although there's a lot of people that ended up dying, is like they learned a lot from those mistakes.
Yeah, you just got to remember how many people actually were saved from that too.
Mm-hmm.
So,
yeah,
all part of the scary game of life. Up to the 1960s, Wilma Rudolph overcame polio to become the fastest woman in the world.
Wait, she got polio?
She had polio.
And then recovered.
She overcame it.
Yeah,
yep.
Okay.
And then she won 3 gold medals in track and field in the 1960s at the Olympics.
Wow.
So Joni Mitchell contracted polio at the age of 9, and it was during her recovery in the hospital that she began performing and singing to patients. And after teaching herself how to play the guitar, she emerged as one of the leading folk performers in the 1960s and 70s.
What was she just not? She was just a single person in a band, or was she a single singer or musician person, or was she in a band with a bunch of people?
All I know is Joni Mitchell is a huge name, and so maybe we don't
maybe somebody else will know. Okay.
We're learning a lot ourselves as we're doing this. Don't pick us for trivia night.
Yeah.
So, since 1979, no cases of polio have originated in the U.S. However, the virus has been brought into the country by travelers with polio. The last time it happened was in 1993, and it takes only one traveler with polio to bring the disease in the U.S. So, hopefully it's identified quickly and eradicated from there, because that could, again, spread like wildfire. So, that's kind of up today's date without getting into the updated epidemic. But a couple fun facts that I've been holding up my sleeve. So a polio victim was kept alive in a metal tube for nearly 60 years. So somebody was in the iron lung, then the power went out and they died.
60 years?
60.
Wow. How long ago did they die, do you know?
I don't know. That's why it's a fun fact and not a chronological, because I don't have the date.
Okay.
But 60 years, I'm guessing sometime in the 30s or 40s.
Wow.
And so probably recently, within the last 10, maybe 20 years, but
Wow.
that sucks.
Yeah.
Another fun fact, orthopedics literally means straighten the child. So you think of like orthopedic surgeon for the legs or orthopedist, originated referring to the practice of doctors treating polio.
Okay.
The gentleman who played Obi-Wan Kenobi in the original Star Wars, Sir Alec Guinness, converted to Catholicism after he believed his son was miraculously cured of polio in response to his prayers. So his son contracted polio and was cured, and he blamed it on God. So
he blamed that his son got better on God?
Yeah,
he gave
God the credit.
Okay.
And he remained a faithful Catholic until his death in 2000.
So it started converting people.
yeah, I guess so. So away from the fun facts and more on to the epidemic update. When the Global Polio Eradication Initiative was formed, polio paralyzed more than 350,000 people a year.
350,000 people?
That's what the fact says. Since that time, polio case numbers have decreased by more than 99%. More than 16 million people have been saved from paralysis because of vaccination efforts against polio, with just 22 cases recorded worldwide in 2017. So, 7 billion people in the world and only 22 cases? That's a pretty low percentage.
Yeah. They consider that basically eradicated, I think.
Yeah. So, along those notes and along those lines, as long as a single child remains infected, children in all countries are at risk, and until every single person and child is cured or vaccinated, there is still a chance of polio spreading. There are just 3 countries which have never stopped transmission of polio, so through Afghanistan, Nigeria, and Pakistan. They face a range of challenges such as insecurity, weak health system, and poor sanitation. Polio can spread from these endemic countries to infect children in other countries with less than adequate vaccination. So pretty scary, and hopefully something can be done. But overall, back to that 22 cases out of 7 billion people. Maybe you'll say this in the science, so you can edit this out, but there are 3 strains of wild poliovirus, none of which can survive for long periods of time outside of the human body. If the virus cannot find an unvaccinated person to infect, it will die out. Type 2 wild poliovirus was eradicated in 1999, and cases of type 3 wild poliovirus haven't been found anywhere in the world since 2012. So, we're doing good. So my last fun fact of the day, there are 2 forms of vaccine available to ward off polio: oral polio vaccine, or OPV, and inactivated polio vaccine, IPV. And because OPV is an oral vaccine, it can be administered by anyone, even volunteers. 1 dose of OPV can cost as little as 14 US cents. So, okay. And that's all my facts.
Polio belongs to the family of Picornavirdae. I hope I'm saying that right. And it is in the genera of enterovirus.
Is it still okay that I would have no idea what that is either way?
So viruses are classified in families, and I think it's mostly based on like genetic familiarity. And so that just is the family that the virus is in. And so it'll tell you about some of the mechanisms of pathogenesis of the virus. Like there's different types of cats. There's different
dogs.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so okay.
So virus is the big overall umbrella category. Then there's lots of different types of viruses.
Mm-hmm.
And then those types of viruses can be grouped together because they have similar characteristics.
Yeah.
I have a feeling we're just dipping our toes into this, so I'm going to need a lot of help.
Okay. Or as we mentioned before, the poliovirus can be entered into a person if on fecal matter, and not that people are normally putting fecal matter on their hand, but it's around and it gets on your hand and you touch something and then you eat something, and that's basically how it gets inside.
Do you know how long polio would last? Like on the outside of a box or on a doorknob?
That's a good question. But I guess until it gets damaged. But the poliovirus is really resistant to... It must be really resistant to the environment, because at least once a polio virus gets into you, it passes through your stomach. And your stomach is like one of the most acidic parts of your body. Just knowing that, I feel like it could live in the environment for a little bit.
Gotcha. Makes sense.
So obviously people would during that time wanted to avoid polio, but because it's incredibly small, in fact, it's 30 nanometers in diameter. So measuring all the way across the virus, you can't see it. In fact, you need like a electron microscope in order to visualize it.
What's the size of a hair, like the width of a hair follicle?
181,000 nanometers. So if your hair is 181,000 nanometers, and you can see that, but just imagine how you can't see 30 nanometer.
So rough calculation off the top of my head, that's 3,000 times smaller than the diameter of a hair follicle?
So it's basically almost 6,000 times smaller than the diameter of your hair.
So, okay, that helps. I have no idea how small that really is, but that gives me some frame of reference.
So yeah, back in the day, I mean, when people are afraid of it, it's not like they could be walking around trying to make sure it's not on their hands.
You wouldn't see it.
Right. If you could see it on the electron microscope, like if you had access to a lab or something, or a scientist, you could detect its shape. It has a icosahedral symmetry. So it's kind of cool looking. If you're interested, Google it.
So if I know circles, triangles, and squares, what would it be closest to?
A lot of triangles put together. Yeah, here's the image.
Looking at, okay, so it's almost like a soccer ball made of triangles instead of hexagons.
Yeah, that's a good explanation. It is thought that the poliovirus actually is derived from the Kawasaki A virus, and kind of diverged after there was a difference in the cellular receptor that allowed it to bind. So instead of binding to ICAM1, this just adhesion molecule, it's binding to a different receptor, and this receptor is CD55. And actually, because of the huge influence polio had on the society, basically, they changed the name of the receptor to the polio receptor, so PBR.
Wow, it's a little nerdy fact for you. That's pretty cool.
Yeah.
So something I would never find researching.
So, I mean, like, I went to the library and found a bunch of books, and then journal articles. So, just talking about how polio is taken up. So again, polio is an enterovirus. And that just means when it's ingested, it travels through the stomach. Most of them, I'm sure, die, but some polioviruses pass through, and then it goes into the gastrointestinal tract, where it can initiate infection at several sites, including the Peyer's patches of the small intestines. There's a considerable amount of evidence that suggests that the poliovirus invades the gastrointestinal tract by transcytosis and the microfolds, so the M cells. So it's like a specific type of cell that it's able to go past by binding to this polio receptor on the cell.
If you could see me, my hand would be going over my head, indicating that this is going over my head, but I still find it interesting.
So the polio, let's say
it gets into your
stomach
through your mouth, can infect your tonsils, and then it goes into your intestines and it can affect things from there. But yet, it said like the M folds or something.
So like your intestines are made up of a bunch of cells, and so
it's like little fingers, little phalanges, right?
Yeah, and so one of those cell types that it's going to first interact with is, they just give it a name. It's like a specific cell type, and it's called the M cell. And so this M cell will present this receptor, this polio receptor, PBR, and it will bind to it and then will enter by transcytosis. This is like the very beginning of you getting the infection.
So basically, just trying to understand it from your body's perspective, and if I was a 5-year-old, is your body pretty much thinking that this cell, this incredibly small virus, is some sort of food particle or nutritious substance? And so it's
So basically, that receptor is there probably for some other reason, but the virus somehow has able to bind to it so that it can survive. So viruses, they want to enter into your body, and they found that if the polio was a person, they were able to find like, oh yeah, I could modify some genes and then bind to this receptor and get in.
Gotcha. So the body isn't necessarily reaching out for this virus. The virus is finding its victim or its new host.
Yeah.
And so that's what it's designed to do. or what it's evolved to do, it's mutated to do, whatever the right word would be,
Yeah.
finds this receptor in the body, and boom, game over.
Yeah. And
Is there an initial Amigo get to this defense mechanism the body has?
yeah, so I would say probably your stomach acid. So your stomach acid, it's a super low pH in your stomach, and it's like that to digest your food, but then it also it works well at killing pathogens.
Gotcha. So polio is a really strong pathogen. So
moving on. So from the initial site of entry, the virus goes past the M cells, and then it travels to the lymph nodes.
And then your lymph nodes are like those little hard pieces of material near your groin or on top of your throat, underneath your jaw.
Yeah, so like when you get sick, they get inflamed, right?
Okay.
So that's an example of what a lymph node is, and they're all over your body.
So is that where that pathogen ultimately tries to end up, or is that just the next step?
That's the next step.
Oh, now where does it go?
And then it will further spread through an efferent lymphatic vessel. So it's basically I'll just say it exits lymph node. So then the virus, it leaves the lymph node and then to enter the bloodstream. In some instances, the virus can spread to central nervous system, and then this is basically what will cause damage to nerves. But this is very rare. Maybe you're wondering why this virus isn't detected by our immune system. Well, first off, the virus replicates so quickly that it can overwhelm organs before there's a chance for the immune system to mount a proper response to kill the virus. And most importantly, it's hard for the immune cells to detect the virus too.
So it's a fast-moving, invasive, aggressive virus.
It's resistant and persistent. And how the immune system is unable to detect the virus, I wanted to give an analogy of this. So say, for example, you're watching TV and you're sitting on a couch, something that, maybe you all do. Say your couch is like right behind a wall, but you put the remote controller on the back of the couch. But say this remote control fell behind the couch. And now you don't want to watch the show that you're currently watching, and so you want to change the channel. And so you have to go get the remote control. And you just have to reach with one arm. For most of us that aren't super tall, you have to move the couch. Because just reaching in, you can't get the channel changer. And so just like that, immune cells cannot always detect the virus because the proteins on the virus surface are kind of hidden in these crevices. And so it's hard for immune cells to reach these crevices to know that it's a virus in the first place.
So it's almost like a physical terrain at a microscopic level that these viruses are hiding in. And then these T cells, B cells, these protector cells are coming in at a higher level, trying to scan everything, make sure everything's all right, so they won't necessarily see the little virus hiding.
Yeah, kind of like that.
Okay.
And so another thing, too, is that these markers on the virus are also susceptible to change. So say, for example, the virus or the immune cell is able to identify the virus in the first place. It can change what it identified in the first place. And so then the immune system has to start over at trying to recognize this virus. That's another way that it evades the immune response.
All right, so I feel like I've got a pretty good understanding of kind of what polio is and how it affects the body, how it gets in, and the damage it can do. But now I'm kind of curious, where did it come from? Has it always been a problem?
So polio has been around for about 4,000 years. And most of the time that it's been around has been not an issue. So there's no reason to believe that there's changes in the genetic makeup that would allow the virus to be more virulent. It may be more likely that there are changes in how we lived that allow the virus to be more virulent in the first place.
Like our food sources or environment or climate?
So basically, sanitation facilities have not been around a whole long amount of time. And so given that we have these things, it's made our environment significantly cleaner. And so because of this, we're not exposed to pathogens at, I'm quoting this, at normal times when we're supposed to. And so we may be experiencing them for the first time later on in life. And so children were normally being exposed to polio like right off the bat. And so their mother, through their breast milk, would give them protection. And so there's these like things called antibodies, and they are passed from mother to child through breast milk, and they'll serve to protect the child against like pathogens such as polio.
So the antibody is, once you're exposed to polio, that's what the body creates. It creates antibodies to protect you from that virus.
But the mom created it, and it has been passed down from the mom to the baby.
Yeah, gotcha. So the sanitation came in, which is good, cleaner environment, but we're not exposed to those viruses anymore. No antibodies, and therefore no protectants.
So we have a cleaner environment, and so then the babies aren't being exposed to polio. So when the mom stops breastfeeding the babies, then they're exposed to polio, and then they don't have protection from the mom through the breast milk. Yeah. And so that's like one hypothesis. I don't know if they've confirmed that, but that's basically what I've been finding in books. And then also dense urban population probably contributed to that, as well as people being able to travel, which helped with the transmission of the virus.
So as horses started being utilized, cars started being invented and used, and buses, trains, airplanes, then it just spread.
Yeah, it's just easier for things to spread that way. And then so it doesn't end if you get polio.
What doesn't end? So I lose my legs and it gets worse?
Potentially. So it's called Postpolio syndrome. And this happens like 30 to 40 years after you got your initial infection. And so basically it's characterized as having the following symptoms: fatigue, pain, weakness. And so the weakness could be so severe that you would be requiring a wheelchair. So could you imagine having polio and thinking that you've escaped it with your life, and then 30, 40 years later, you're in a wheelchair from pain because of it? Yeah.
So what's it doing for 30 years? It's just dormant, chilling?
There's no evidence that poliovirus might persist in humans for 40 years. However, and such persistence seems unlikely. Other possible explanations. So we don't really know, but there's failure of motor neurons in post-polio syndromes. So it's not that you have the poliovirus still in you, but it's failure of motor neurons that cause post-polio syndrome.
So would that have been damage from the poliovirus initially?
Yeah, but I don't know why it would why you would get problems 30, 40 years later. Like, I don't know why it would take that long.
I don't know. That's interesting.
And so the worst part about post-polio syndrome is that it could cause difficulty breathing and your muscles to shrink.
Wow, so right back to square one, potentially.
It sounds like it.
And do you know if the severity of the PPS depends on the severity of the initial polio?
I don't know how they would even get that information, because it happened 30, 40 years prior to getting polio.
Yeah, that's fascinating though.
After getting polio. Yeah.
Wow, good thing there's vaccines.
I want to highlight one of the most important immune cells that are for combating polio.
Is this your favorite cell?
No, it's not my favorite cell, but it's an important one. And it's called the B cell. And this cell, it makes antibodies, which are important in protecting you against polio.
How does it make antibodies?
So B cells interact with other types of cells that will communicate to the B cell like, hey, there's this pathogen and you need to make antibodies to kill it.
So it's a tattletale.
Yeah, that's a good one. All right, so it is a tattletale, but it's a tattletale for us.
That's saving your life.
Yeah. So the most important thing to know about the immune system is it is able to identify, or supposed to be able to identify, self from non-self. And so given that the B cell is a tattletale, once it's identified something that's not self, then it can make antibodies against it and protect you from it by like neutralizing it or binding to it to prevent it from binding to that polio receptor we talked about earlier.
So it could like neutralize it like you tase somebody, so it just puts it like stops it from becoming violent or from what it's doing, or bind to it like wrapping itself around it.
So antibody kind of looks like a finger that you're kind of doing the peace sign with.
Okay.
And then the ends of your fingers will bind to, say, a part of polio. And it could do a couple things. It could be an indicator to other cells to be like a tag. Like, hey, kill this.
Like it's left a print, like a spray paint mark, or like it's actually physically attached to it?
It's physically attached to it. Yeah. And so then another cell, say like a natural killer cell, will identify it and then destroy it. So it's like a little tag. Another thing that it can do is it prevent it from potentially from binding to that polio receptor and then inhibiting it from getting into that M cell.
Gotcha. So with the little the B cell hanging onto this little poliovirus, the little poliovirus can't get into the receptor that we talked about earlier.
Yeah.
It physically can't fit.
Right. It can't go into.
So I didn't realize that everything's so small it's hard to imagine it, but it's on a physical scale. It's actually physically interacting and policing and encountering and engaging and stopping, or it's almost like I'm imagining kind of a outside terrain and you're navigating inside the little cracks and crevices. It's a lot different mental picture I have now than when I did before. So what do you imagine? Describe the scene when you're imagining all this, because I'm just thinking like an artery and everything's just kind of floating along and things are in this little tube. But now I'm thinking like this vast open plain with, looks kind of simple up top, but once you take a closer look, there's cracks and crevices and it's easy to get around. And then you have larger entities up top floating around trying to find things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I mean, like, comparing the B cell to the poliovirus, so we said that the poliovirus is 30 nanometers. The B cell is 7,000 nanometers.
So the B cell is massive compared to the virus.
Yeah. And so these antibodies, I imagine that they're significantly smaller. But however, if they bind specifically enough, they could inhibit it from interacting from the receptor and entering. But I mean, these antibodies can also be the tag for destruction.
How do you measure these things?
I'm Googling them. I think that wraps it up. Thank you for listening to our podcast.
I had fun.
Me too. Thank you for being my co-host, Justin.
You're welcome. Thanks for being my host.
If you like what you heard but have questions, feel free to reach out at us at excelsior2018@gmail.com. This is Excelsior, a podcast that shares science with the general public. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this podcast. Please feel free to write us comments on iTunes, Twitter, Stitcher,
Facebook,
YouTube. I'm Candice Limper, and I'm sending out.